Review on lighting and the light triangle. Lighting is going to be something that even if you're just wanting to take better photos, even on an iPhone, it's something you're going to want to be familiar with. You're going to want to get comfortable with lighting. You're going to want to understand good lighting, not good lighting, to be able to notice good lighting in the moment and even adjust and move somebody. Like if you're taking a picture of somebody, move somebody to make sure they're in good lighting. That's going to be something you're going to want to know. And then for the light triangle, that is going to play directly to your camera settings. So whatever camera you have, all the numbers on your camera, that is what the light triangle is. And so a lot of you have asked about getting from off of auto settings to manual settings. So that is one of our goals, is to get you onto those manual settings for you to start understanding what it means to change your settings depending on the situation you're in, depending on your lighting situation, and for you to have more control over your camera and ultimately over how your picture turns out. So for some of you, this is going to be a review. I know that. I totally get that this is kind of just going back through some of the steps that you already know. And some of you are already utilizing all this and you're out shooting already, and that's awesome. But then for some of you, this will be brand new. So humor me. And so for those of you who it's brand new and it might seem a little overwhelming, just stick with me. We'll talk it through. And then for those of you that it's review, hopefully you can still pick something out of it and learn something that maybe you hadn't noticed before. So lighting, I'm actually just going to use a couple pictures from my wedding as an example. This picture, well, it's not a great photo. And let's just figure out why. So it's not because I'm out of focus. It's supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be like focused on Nick and I'm in the background. So all that's fine. The framing's fine. The camera was good. The photographer was good. The settings are right. Everything's right. So what is wrong with it? Well, you can see like Nick's suit is like 8 different shades of blue. It's like a bunch of different, it kind of has this funky shadows and highlights on it. His face, honestly, looks a little bit scary because of the lighting. Like his teeth look really dark. His eyes are really dark. He has these like kind of bright, unflattering highlights on his face. And it's kind of like this green hue from the grass and the trees that's like shining onto his skin tone. And if you look at me, obviously being out of focus, it's less obvious, but it's still very much the same situation. Like my eyes are dark, I have some unflattering shadows on my face, my hair. It's just not what you want. And so in this photo, you could maybe change it to black and white, and it might look a little bit better, just because you're not getting some of those green hues and some of like even like the darker colors where it's kind of like almost like yellowy and just super unflattering. You can change it to black and white, and then that won't be quite as obvious. But other than that, like there's really nothing to be done to make this photo a good photo. A lot of people think that with lighting, like, oh, the lighting's not great, you can just fix it in editing. Wrong. You can't. That is not how that works, because this photo is edited the same as this photo. And this photo, same camera, same photographer, same place, same day. This photo is way better. And so here's why, is we're actually, so it's still the daytime, so it's still like the middle of the day sun, but we're in the shade, so we're all evenly lit. So as you can see, everyone's dresses, everyone's suits are the correct color. There's no funky shadows. Everyone's skin tones are able to be their natural skin tones. We all have slightly different skin tones. Like my sisters have pretty fair skin, as does my niece. My dad and brothers and Nick have like some darker skin. Nick actually has more olive skin than anybody in this picture. And so even his skin, I mean, it's not drastically different, but you can see how his skin tone, underneath his skin tone, is like golden versus my dad's is more red, and Davis's is more red. So you're actually able to see all those natural skin tones just exist, and they're just there. And it's not that I did something better here with the editing. It's just that this was evenly lit, a well-lit photo. So it means that the colors are able to exist naturally, and they're able to be exposed the way like their natural selves, and their colors are able to be seen naturally. So lighting affects everything. It affects color. Colors don't change. Like a lot of times people are like, oh, well, that looks super funky in this photo. Like my dress looks like a weird color. My skin looks like a weird color or something like that. Obviously, your dress, your skin did not change color. It's because of the lighting. So this is just something to know. and we'll go more into lighting, but this is something to work on and get more comfortable with, and start understanding that lighting is going to affect all your photos, and for you to be aware of what is good lighting is going to be huge moving forward. So here's some direct sunlight. Direct sun can be used in really cool ways for photos, even like editorially with different type of photography styles. You see some photographers utilize direct sun, and it's really beautiful and it's really unique, and I'm all about it. I think it's so cool. But this would be an example of like not so great direct sun. So most of the times when direct sun is being used, it is not going to be in the middle of the day. It's going to be towards the end of the day when the sun is setting and the sun is a little softer, and it's also with a more editorial style, so you also need to shoot with your style in mind. So if you're going for a more natural look, then direct sunlight is not going to necessarily be your friend, because the natural brighter colors, it's just going to be overwhelming. And so here, this like 3 p.m. bright sun is obviously not what you want, and so this was just kind of unfortunate like placement of these two. It's still an adorable picture. Ivy's so precious, and so I still love this picture, but it is just a little bright. It's not ideal. A lot of people think that the direct sun is what you want, and they put people in the direct sun because they're thinking, oh, you're well lit, like let's be in the sun, but actually what you'd prefer is to be backlit. So this is backlighting, so you can see all that sun is behind them. And they're also in the shade, so sometimes with backlighting you don't have any shade, and what you want is you just want to put the sun behind your subject even if you don't have any shade, so then that photo will be still pretty bright, but it would be better for the sun to be behind the subject than directly in front, especially if you're working with that midday sun because it's just so bright. So if I was taking pictures in the middle of the day and I had a bright sun out, well, obviously it's not going to be golden hour, like I can't make it golden hour, but what I can do is I can direct my subject so that the sun is behind them, or like kind of behind and to the side of them, so it's like shining on their side but to the back, so it's not shining straight on their face. And so here is an example of backlighting. Sometimes backlighting will make your subject a little dark because behind them is so bright. So here, when I edited this photo, I did select Ivy and Logan in Lightroom and like brighten them up and take away some shadows just to keep them bright. And we can go through more Lightroom stuff in the future and go through how to do all that. But just know that you're actually going to want to choose backlighting for this type of situation over if you have to choose between direct lighting or backlighting. And then this is daytime shade. So this is similar to that group picture that I showed you from our wedding. Is basically just, I mean, you can still see it's bright outside, but they're fully in the shade. So this is going to be your best lit situation, the best situation that you could be in, where it's just everything's well lit, they're evenly lit, but you still have that sun that is making your colors bright and natural and fun. All right, so here's the difference. All the same editing. Trying to be the same editing, but obviously the last one is going to be our best photo from a lighting standpoint. But we even like this backlighting, this middle photo turned out pretty great, just with a little extra help. All right, so now we're going to get into the lighting triangle. So this is going to be some numbers, and it can be a little bit overwhelming just because all the pieces are playing in together, but just bear with me. I promise we will continue to talk it through, and I will do my best to explain it. And it really does, like, once you get the hang of it, it really is not that complicated, and some of you already have the hang of it, and you know this. It just takes time to get comfortable with it. So I don't want you to be intimidated by it. Just know that it does take time. So aperture is going to be what I would argue the first thing in most settings. You are going to set your aperture first. This is going to be your focus or your depth of field. So on your camera, it actually shows up as a number with an F in front of it. And so here, this is an example of what we call a high aperture, which has a deep depth of field. That means that the whole picture, a big portion of the picture is in focus. So your depth of field is choosing the section of the picture, the section of the area that is going to be in focus. So depending on what type of photo you're taking is going to determine how deep or shallow your depth of field needs to be, which is going to determine how high or low your aperture needs to be. So here, a high aperture which is a deep depth of field, which is what I want for a landscape photo, because when I'm taking a landscape photo, I don't want to just focus in on one tree. I want all the trees and the entire lake in focus. I want it to be sharp. I want to be able to see it all. So I bump it's called your f-stop on your computer. This is the harder one, and so bear with me again, and I'm sorry if I completely botch explaining it, but I will continue to walk it through and give examples when we talk on Friday and Saturday. High aperture, deep depth of field, but it's called your f-stop on your camera. On your camera, your aperture is also called the f-stop, and so that is where the F on the number comes from. And so on your camera, your aperture will show itself as F and a number beside it. So usually I don't say aperture in the moment when I'm shooting. I say f-stop. So this is why this is confusing, because there's multiple names for it, and it just feels like you're contradicting yourself, and it's just a lot of moving parts. And then you also have depth of field, and so you're like, wait, which one is it? It's all of the above. And I'm sure there's someone out there that can explain it better. And I know for a fact there is, and I will continue to work on explaining it and trying to make it super clear. But this is an example of a high aperture, and so the higher your f-stop goes, the deeper your depth of field will be. So on your camera, if you see f4.5, that is going to be kind of a middle range f-stop. That is going to be kind of a middle aperture. That is going to be good for like a group of people, like a group of 4 or 5 or 6 people. Usually when I'm shooting, I'm ranging from either a lower aperture or a really high aperture, depending on if I'm shooting people or shooting a landscape photo. So obviously here, once again, landscape photo, deep depth of field, so it's all in focus. My aperture is high, f11, and I'm just wanting all of that to be sharp, versus low aperture. I wanted a shallow depth of field here, and so a shallow depth of field is really what you're going to want for those portraits, which is going to be most of y'all's photography. So here we have Maggie, who I want to be in focus, and I want her to be super sharp and clear, but I want everything behind her. I want it all blurred out because it really makes her pop and it brings the focus to her. So the ground behind her, the flower bed, Tillman, the tree, it's all very blurred out, and that is because I lowered my aperture so I could have a shallow depth of field, so there's a smaller portion of the area in front of me is in focus, and that was at f2.5. And so this is like my comfortable spot for f-stop is going to be 2 point something, just because I shoot a lot of portraits. And so usually if I'm 1 or 2 people and taking pictures of them, I like to stay into f2 point something. And then if you have more people, sometimes you raise your f-stop to make sure everybody's in focus. And like if you have a group and people are staggered, you want to make sure that the person in front is not, you don't want to have the person in front in focus and the person in the back not in focus. So that's where you would raise your f-stop to have a deeper depth of field so that everyone's in focus. So again, we'll go over this more and we can give more examples and we can talk about it more and you can ask all the questions. But just know that there is a high aperture and a low aperture. High aperture is going to be a deep depth of field. Low aperture is your shallow depth of field. For most of your photography, you are going to want a low aperture just because that is the area you live in, the upstate area. The type of photography that's available is portraits mostly, so that is going to be what you want. And most nicer lenses, one of the things, like the perks about a really nice lens is that it does go low on that f-stop will go low, and so that is what makes a lot of people's photos look and feel more professional, is having that shallow depth of field. So deep depth of field, shallow depth of field. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is going to be how fast your photo is being taken. So shutter speed is kind of the high number that you're seeing, or one of the high numbers. Actually, there's 2 high numbers, so ignore that. Shutter speed is one of the high numbers that you're seeing on your camera, and it's usually changing a lot, especially if you're on auto settings. So when you go on manual, you'll be setting it yourself of how fast you want your photo taken. So here, back to our wedding, just because it's an easy example. As you can see, this photo is a little bit blurry. Like dad's face, us, we're just kind of, there's a little bit of motion blur. And so it's not like completely blurry where you can't use the photo, but it's blurry enough that you can notice. And so what that is it's just slightly too low a shutter speed. So shutter speed is going to be the opening and closing of your shutter and how fast it's opening and closing. And so obviously the faster it opens and closes, the sharper your photo is going to be. If you have a really low shutter speed and you have a moving subject, well, they're capturing that movement, and if it's open for a long time, it's capturing all that movement, versus if it opens and closes really fast, well, then it captures like the still shot. It's just capturing just a little moment. It's not capturing the movement. So the longer your shutter is open, the more it's going to capture, and that's why it captures more movement. That's why a photo might be blurry. And so a lot of times when you're on auto settings, because a situation may be dark, your camera automatically sets a low shutter speed and you're 1/60, and you're like, gosh, why are my photos blurry? Well, this is why. And so this is not what we want. We want to have a little bit higher a shutter speed because we want our photos to be very sharp, and we want to make sure we're aware of how to make our photos sharp and how to get those sharp photos. So that's the biggest thing that we're working on, is making sure we're aware of what settings are going to make sure we get those sharp photos. And when we do have a blurry photo, why do we have a blurry photo? And we're aware that maybe it's our shutter speed, maybe it's figuring out what's going on so that we can become more aware of our camera settings and how to do better in the future. So as back to this example, this is just slightly too low a shutter speed. And so 1/200, we're kind of moving in this photo. So honestly, if I was taking this picture, I would have my shutter speed a little bit higher at like 1/250 or 1/320. And even here, you see that the shutter speed was moved to 1/320 just a couple moments later, and this photo is pretty sharp. And it's in focus, and so it's not blurry. And so this is really what you want, is you want these photos to be sharp and you want them to be clean. And so you want to keep your shutter speed in a place where you can get those sharp photos. Something just to note is the best photos in the world are taken with a very low shutter speed. So pictures of a night sky in Alaska with the stars and the aurora lights, the aurora lights is going to be taken on a camera that was like sat by all night by a photographer, and they left the shutter open all night. Like, some cameras do that. It's crazy. Because when you have a shutter open, it's capturing everything that's happening. So it's capturing all the stars, it's capturing everything that's happening in the night sky all night, so that picture comes out at the end of the night, and it's this perfect photo with everything that happened that night in the sky. So in a sense, like on principle, a lower shutter speed is actually better because you're capturing more and more light is coming in. So it's good to know that principle, but also know that when you're taking pictures of people, you can't have that low a shutter speed because they're going to just be blurry, because people move and we move when we hold our camera. Like people who do that all night for the picture, they have it on a tripod, everything's perfectly still, they like do all this work to make sure their camera stays perfectly still all night. So what we have to remember is that a low shutter speed actually makes for the best photo. It like makes for creamier skin tones because it's bringing in more light, and so it's not quite as harsh. It's actually a more beautiful photo can come from a lower shutter speed, and a kind of a softer looking photo. But if you have too low a shutter speed when you're taking pictures of people, when you're holding a camera, your pictures are just going to be blurry. So what does it look like to constantly work with that tension of, okay, I want as low a shutter speed as I can get, but I also need to make sure it's not too low that my photos are blurry. And so that's why my favorite is 1/320 and 1/250. 1/250 if I feel like people, it's kind of still, but 1/320 for just most general shots. And then if I have something that I know is like heavily action oriented, then I'll bump it up from there, just because I would rather at least have like some sharp photos than a bunch of blurry ones. But I'm constantly balancing that tension of like, I want, the best skin tones. I want the best photos. I want as much light coming into my camera as possible, and the lower shutter speed brings in more light, but I can't have a blurry photo. So this is just something important, and you start to realize that there's always tension being held within camera settings of like, well, I want this, but I also want this. So how do I balance that? So shutter speed is constantly being adjusted throughout the day, no matter where you are. Like, I mean, whether you go inside or you're outside, you're in shade, you're in the sun, you're constantly having to change it to adjust to the situation you're in, and be thinking about what is going to get you your best photo. Low shutter speed is also what people use to do the intentional motion blur. So not necessarily this isn't really a great example, because this is just like, for this doesn't really look like intentional motion blur. It's really just like, this photo's just a little blurry. But some people do that intentional motion blur where it's like super trendy right now too, and it's really cool, where they do like a blurry photo intentionally, and that would be that would happen because they lowered their shutter speed. But it really works best when you are, when it's either getting dark, so it's like towards golden hour or blue hour, which is after golden hour, or you raise your aperture a bunch just to make sure your photo isn't overexposed. But honestly, like, I can show all of that later. I don't want to like get too much into that because that's more of an editorial stylistic decision, and right now we just need to know the classic basic rules on how to get good photos. Because then if you want to go and make an editorial decision later with your style, that's awesome, and please do. But for now, the most important thing is learning those basics. And then the last thing is ISO. This is what we call fake light. So obviously what you want more than fake light would be real light. This would be the most valuable, would be natural daylight. That's why people take pictures by windows. That's why people want to go outside instead of staying inside. That's why, certain like wedding venues are harder than others because it's just dark. And we want natural light. So when we don't have that natural light, our camera gives us something called ISO, which is our fake light. So here, for example, this is one of those wedding venues that is quite challenging. This is downtown, Grace Downtown in Greenville. And it's not the hardest wedding venue for sure, but it's not easy either. So there are windows, but it still is pretty dark inside. And so what I have to do in this moment is I have to bump my ISO up. So I want to make sure all the windows are open, get as much light as I can, but I have to bump my ISO up, and that's what this number is here, 1600. This is a higher ISO, and I usually don't like going above 1600 because it just gets too grainy, because the fake light will make your photo grainier and grainier. So if you ever see like a really grainy photo, usually it's because the photographer had a really high ISO, or maybe if you take pictures indoors and you have your settings on auto, then it would automatically bump your ISO really high, and you'd be like, man, all my photos are like super grainy. It's because your camera bumped your ISO really high to get you more light, but maybe it bumped it too high, so now all your photos are kind of grainy and you don't love them. So I like to be careful with ISO. I don't want to be afraid of it because it's there to be helpful, but I do like to be careful with it. And so this is an example where I needed some high ISO because it was indoors. And this would be an example of low ISO. Obviously, same day, same couple, same place, but now we're outside. It's obviously a bright day. Even though we're in shade, there's still plenty of sun. So I dropped my ISO because I have all the sun I need. I have all the sun from outside, and it's super bright. And so I dropped my ISO to one of the lowest settings that it can be on because I don't need any fake light because I have all my real light. And I adjust my settings accordingly. So even though I said a lot of times you set your aperture first, I still agree with that, just because, there's very rarely would you set your aperture anything but like what your subject is. Like, sorry, that was terrible the way I said that. That was not helpful. If I'm taking pictures of these two, so let's start that thought over. If I'm taking pictures of these two, of Ariel and Luke here, indoors or outdoors, my ISO is going to change because indoors and outdoors, but my aperture is not, because I'm taking pictures of the two of them. And so I'm going to keep my aperture on that 2.0 or 2.5 or 2.8 to make sure the two of them are in focus. I'm not changing my aperture because I don't want to change it too low to like 1 point something, because I'm like, no, I'm taking pictures of two people. They need to both be in focus. And honestly, 1 point something ISO, 1 point something aperture is going to be too low. But I'm also not going to bump it up. Like when I get outdoors, I'm not going to leave my ISO high and then be like, oh, it's super bright because I have all this fake light. Let me just bump up my aperture so that it's darker. I'm not going to do that because no, I'm still taking pictures of the two people, and I want to prioritize that aperture because that aperture is super important. And so I want to prioritize the aperture, keep the aperture at the 2.5 or 2.8, and I want to bring my ISO back down because I don't need that light anymore. And so the ISO is usually going to be your like helpful adjustment. So like you don't want it unless you need it, and then when you need it, it's great. But outside, I don't need it. So I'm going to, or unless it's like the sun is setting and maybe it's getting dark, then I might need some ISO, and that's helpful. But just in general, like on a bright sunny day, I don't need that much ISO. So I don't want to use it unless I need it because I would prefer to use the natural light. So like I'm saying, all your settings are going to be constantly moving and adjusting, and they're all going to be playing into one another. And obviously, like my shutter speed here inside might be a little bit lower, as low as I can get it, because it's a dark venue. Excuse me. It's a dark venue, and I want as much light as I can get, so I'm going to put my shutter speed as low as I can possibly get it, without them being blurry. But then here, I'm going to bump my shutter speed up a little bit because they're moving and it's outside and it's bright and I have plenty of light, and I want to get some sharp photos of him spinning her. So I'm going to bump my ISO up to make sure they're not blurry. I'm going to bump my shutter speed up to make sure they're not blurry. And then that's going to give me those sharp photos, and they're not going to be too like overexposed because my shutter speed is higher. So I know that was a lot. Like a lot, and I know that it's a lot of words, and I'm saying like, and I even like, said the wrong words at certain parts and had to go back and correct myself, so I'm sure that was confusing. But I just wanted to give y'all an overview of these settings before we got together to talk through them. So I know, again, like I know that was probably a little bit overwhelming, or just maybe it was just completely confusing, maybe you don't understand at all. And that is totally fine. So please don't panic or worry or stress. I want to talk about it a lot more, and I want to answer all your questions you have. And I want to be helpful in any way. And if there's anything that I explained that you're like, okay, I don't get this at all, I just need you to re-explain it. That is totally fine. I am learning alongside you of how to teach these things while you're learning these things. So please just let me know what you need from me. And so when we get together to talk about things, just have questions, and even if you have a camera, start looking at these settings in your camera, looking at what it might take to like go to manual and move them around and go outside and see the difference when you change those settings, when you change that f-stop and that shutter speed and that ISO. Just go play with it, and then come back with questions, and we'll talk through it, and we'll talk all together. I'm sure whatever questions you have, someone else has as well. So let's make sure we get to talk about all those things Friday and Saturday. I'm super pumped and can't wait to talk to you all and just continue to learn photography together. Thanks, guys.